the Sermon on the Mount, or the Key to Christianity. An interpretation by Pekka Ervast. 5. The First Commandment. Matt 5:21. You have heard that it was said to them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, for whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of the judgment. 22. But I say unto you, that every one who is angry with his brother shall be in danger of the judgment, and whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka, shall be in danger of the Sanhedrin, and whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of the Gehenna of fire. 23. If therefore thou art offering thy gift at the altar, and there rememberest that thy brother hath aught against thee, 24. Leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to thy brother, and coming thence thou offerest thy gift. 25. Agree with thine adversary quickly, whiles thou art with him in the way, lest haply the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. 26. Amen, I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou have paid the last farthing. I do not quite see where, in the text, is to be found the first commandment you speak of. Surely Jesus does not annul the prohibition to kill, given by Moses? Of course not. Non-killing is natural to him who fulfills the first commandment of Jesus, which is, in short, do not be angry. A rather remarkable and interesting rule of life, very difficult to follow. Do you think the meaning really is that this maxim should be followed always and everywhere? Whosoever wishes to follow in the footsteps of Jesus and enter into the kingdom of heaven must absolutely keep this commandment constantly in mind and ever try to follow it. He may fall, but he must never deny the commandment or explain it away as being of no consequence. If so, we Christians seem not to have known that commandment, for even in our theology, we talk of the holy wrath, which seems to us very righteous indeed. Nor do I credit Christendom with having known these commandments. Christendom is still living in the old dispensation, keeping strictly to the 10 commandments of Moses, although evidently even these have become too strong for people to follow. For if nations as well as individuals were to observe the commandment of Moses, Thou shalt not kill, what would become of the Christian wars? It goes without saying that the commandments of Jesus are still less known and understood by Christendom. The commandments of Jesus are given as free exhortations. If you want to be Christians, do as I command. If you do not want to, nobody will force you into obedience. You are to choose freely between the bliss of heaven and the pains caused by your earthly passions. Now, if the first commandment is, Thou shalt not be angry, what might Jesus have in view with reference to those manifold penalties said by him to be earned by the offender? Shall we as Christians bear witness against people every time we see them lose their temper without their having brought about anything really evil? By no means. These things were spoken by way of comparison, as Leo Tolstoy very appropriately remarked. Jesus speaks of the 3 degrees of anger. 1. Who is angry with his brother, i.e. who becomes angry with him in his heart. 2. Whosoever shall say to his brother, Raka, i.e. who gives expression to his anger by contemptuous words and deeds. 3. Whoever shall say, Thou fool, i.e. who by shouting and screaming behaves like a madman himself. In the first degree, a Christian who becomes angry in his heart is as guilty as was, in former times, a murderer brought into court. In the second degree, a Christian who gives way to his anger in words is as guilty as, for example, a blasphemer, whose offense, with the Jews, was considered to be of the greatest, and who therefore was judged by the Sanhedrin or High Council of Jerusalem. In the third degree, a Christian giving way to his rage is as guilty as those who were burned by the fire in the valley of Hinnom, or perhaps, from another point of view, as guilty as they who are in need of purification by the fire of unspeakable mental agonies. I do not believe any thinking people could possibly understand the words of Jesus otherwise than by way of these comparisons. Jesus, indeed, does not counsel us to sue anybody at law. On the contrary, he counsels us to avoid being prosecuted ourselves by quickly agreeing with our adversary. And further on in the Sermon on the Mount he says, "If any man would go to law with thee, and take away thy coat, let him have thy cloak also." This clearly indicates the moral standpoint of Jesus. But why does Jesus, who once said that God was to be worshipped in spirit and in truth, speak of altars and gifts in the subsequent verses? By examining his words we are sure to find his real meaning. Did you observe that I had translated the 24th verse in the following way, "And coming thence thou offerest thy gift"? The usual version is, "And come then and offer thy gift." The Greek text has kai tot elthon prosphia to dron su, which is in English, "And coming thence offer thy gift." Prosphia is the imperative form, but evidently an error in writing of the copyist. It should be the second person of the present indicative tense, prospherace, thou offerest, so as the Latin text of the Vergio Vulgata has it, et tunc veniens offers munum tuum. Offers does not mean offer, but thou offerest. The Latin text has preserved the right meaning, for Jesus wishes to state that reconciliation with an adversary is a genuine gift, and the only one asked for by God. God has no need of burnt offerings. Coming from thy adversary after having agreed with him, thou indeed offerest to God what thou hadst to offer, thy own quarrelsome and cold heart. The seemingly affirmative speech about altars and gifts is thereby shown to be a criticism characterizing the external gift as rather childish. One more question, please. The following verses seem to indicate that Jesus was afraid of judges, officers of law, and prisons, although he previously had said that they were blessed who were persecuted. How is that to be understood? Do you not see the difference? Blessed are his followers when persecuted for their own righteousness, but here the question is of strife and of quarrel, of the disciples' own error or fault, and being brought into court or put into prison for the sake of one's own failings, instead of furthering the work of the kingdom of heaven hinders its progress or retards it. The disciples shall walk about preaching the good message of the kingdom, they are the salt of the earth, and their light shall shine, but being brought into prison would put their light under a bushel. That is true enough. But was there any reason to suppose that the disciples would fall out with worldly people? And that they would quarrel about debts and possessions? Jesus, in the last verse, is represented as stating almost threateningly that nobody will get out of prison before paying the last farthing. I certainly do not understand this. Generally, men are weak and imperfect when seeking entrance into the kingdom of heaven, and accordingly inclined to fall into the snares of mammon, but that was not the case with the nearest disciples of Jesus. They had left all and followed him. The Master is possibly speaking of future times and future followers. However, I see your point of view, for the words, "Thou shalt not come out thence till thou hast paid the last farthing," seem to involve a menace, if we do not presume that Jesus was so deeply convinced of the righteousness of the worldly court of law that he was simply stating a fact. What is your opinion? I am inclined to doubt that Jesus had such a robust faith in the worldly court of law. The whole of his teaching and spirit seems to me to be something of a moral revolt against the wrongs of the human society, at least a liberation from its bonds, if I have caught the meaning of your explanations, so that I am sorry to say these words of Jesus ring in my ears with a menacing sound. Am I wrong? I understand you perfectly, and now you must allow me, in passing, to interpret these verses from quite another point of view, from such a point of view that this last verse will no longer sound like a menace but quietly state a fact in life. I am rather curious. This is, as I said, only in passing, for it will carry us into theological questions, teachings, and dogmas, which ought to be, but not always are, imprinted on our minds with the same immediateness as moral conceptions. However, I myself am fully convinced that Jesus had in mind just the thing I am going to mention. He says, "Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art with him in the way, lest haply the adversary deliver thee to the judge," etc. Now I beg to ask you, what is the meaning of the words, "whilst thou art with him in the way"? Of course it means, while you still are alive, for if the adversary dies, how will it then be possible to agree? But do you not see that then also disappears the very possibility of being delivered to the judge, etc.? If the adversary of the disciple dies, then there is no danger of a lawsuit, and if the disciple himself dies, then no worldly court of law can reach him. The riddle may be formally solved by supposing that from the text of Matthew was omitted the explanatory clause preserved in the Gospel of Luke, 12:58, where it is said, "For as thou art going with thine adversary before the magistrate, on the way give diligence to be quit of him, lest haply he hale thee unto the judge, and the judge shall deliver thee to the officer, and the officer shall cast thee into prison." Then there follows, also with Luke, the same final sentence that sounds like a menace, "I say unto thee, thou shalt by no means come out thence, till thou have paid the very last mite." In this way, truly, the being in the way derives a plain and simple interpretation, but, nevertheless, it leaves the impression that Jesus had a mighty faith in worldly righteousness. And if what he said was spoken caustically, if his meaning was like this, "Agree with thine adversary by all means, for thou wilt never win thy suit before the law," in any case, the worldly court will decide that thou shouldst pay. This sounds rather bitter, although, perhaps, who knows? But if I understood you aright, you promised to solve the riddle in quite another fashion? Yes, in my opinion the verses have another, deeper meaning. The sentence, "whilst thou art with him in the way," or "thou art going with thine adversary before the magistrate," should be translated just as you proposed a while ago, viz. "while you still are alive," or "while you still are on the way to the Prince of life and death." The Latin text has "cum vadis ad principem." Now let us read anew the 25th verse in a simple and natural way. It runs, "Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou yet art with him in the way, lest haply the adversary deliver thee to the judge," etc. What else is the plain, logical meaning of that sentence but, "Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art with him in the way, for if thou diest he shall deliver thee to the judge," etc. Do you see? Yes, that is plain logic. In that case, however, the words of Jesus remain senseless. No doubt, if we keep to the text of Matthew, supposing that Jesus had in view only earthly conditions. But why should we not try to understand what other things Jesus possibly had in mind? Let us turn our attention in quite another direction. Tell me, please, is there not a lifelong adversary for every man, Christian as well as pagan, disciple as well as ordinary man? An adversary, moreover, with whom it is good to agree while yet alive. What do you mean? Ah, I see, man often quarrels with himself, when he cannot or will not or does not think it suitable to gratify his passions and caprices. Thus he has an adversary within himself. Yes, but do you think Jesus meant to say that man should quickly gratify his desires? Of course not. Rather the other way. But what are you aiming at? You are on the right track, but does not man possess any other self with whom he may conflict? Why, to be sure, he has got his better self, his conscience, with which he easily comes into conflict. Quite so. Man's conscience, and we may often add, his enlightened reason and his human heart, is that higher self whose voice he does not always obey, thereby coming into conflict with it. This is his lifelong adversary. It is good to agree quickly with one's higher self and to do it while still alive, for after death the everyday personality will be abandoned by the higher self. In other words, man loses his conscience in death, if he has not made it his own during life, so that it has become his own ego, so to say. Reason and conscience are the light of our higher self. Therefore Jesus says, in the Gospel of John, "Walk while you have the light, that darkness overtake you not, and he that walketh in the darkness knoweth not whither he goeth." While you have the light, believe on the light, that ye may become sons of light. These are metaphysical things, but ignorant man should be able to feel their truth in his spirit. Dying man comes into darkness indeed, for then his higher self, his conscience, delivers him to the judge, and the judge delivers him to the officer, and he is put into prison, and verily he shall not come out of the prison before being purified from all neglects and sins and vices. You refer to the dogma of purgatory. The Catholic Church is thus right? Preaching this dogma of purgatory, the Catholic Church has preserved the original Christian teaching in better memory than has the Protestant Church, for undoubtedly the Gospels proclaim an intermediate state after death called by them Hades or Sheol or purgatory. And I see something else still in those words of Jesus about the prison. I see in them an allusion to the law of rebirth. For, as to our coming into conflict with our conscience, how does it happen in most cases? Surely in our dealings with other people. We are cold and heartless, proud and brusque, envious and malicious, wrongdoers and neglectful as to our duties, false and lying. There is no end to the list of our multifarious sins. And they all burden our conscience. Our conscience urgently demands certain things. It calls upon us to change our mind, to ask forgiveness and reconciliation, to purify and renew our habits of life. But we neglect all this. We prefer to be in conflict with our conscience rather than to humble ourselves before men. And the consequence? Our bad deeds and neglected duties are written in the book of life, for future atonement. And where shall this atonement take place? In that same visible life where the offences have been committed. The prison into which we are cast is just this corporeal life, and we shall not indeed be free from the necessity of reincarnation until we have paid our last debt. Over and over again man must be reborn on earth. In truth, the doctrine of reincarnation is an interesting teaching. And, moreover, it is lucid and natural if we think of life as a school, an educational institute for the welfare of man. But what do you mean by saying that everything is to be atoned in this same life where the offences have been committed? Must we make amends to everybody we have sinned against? We do not, however, remember having lived before. We don't know against whom we have sinned nor who is our debtor, and does it go without saying that we are all reborn at the same time? A pertinent remark. There is, indeed, no need for us to think of the atonement in so literal a way. We are reborn rather indifferently, at various places and times, each according to his own karma or destiny, and there are few amongst us tied one to another by such strong bonds of love or hate that they go to the school of life, so to say, hand in hand. To them we are in a position personally to make amends for past wrongs and neglects, and also to make new debts, but generally, I suppose, the law of life works somewhat like this: as much suffering as we have caused to living beings, as much joy and happiness are we bound to create. That is our atonement, and it will liberate us step by step from the necessity of rebirth. But what will become of the atonement of Jesus taught by our Christian Church, if man himself is his own Redeemer? It will remain where it belongs, in the imagination of ignorant and inexperienced men. But why does not Christianity teach reincarnation? You mean a churchianity? Permit me to answer by the following historical fact. In AD 553, the Synod of Constantinople, convened by the Emperor Justinian, condemned the doctrine of reincarnation as a dangerous heresy. Whosoever teaches the pre-existence of the soul and the strange belief therefrom derived that the soul returns on earth, he shall be damned. The belief in an exterior Saviour had little by little gained ground in the Church, but as there were many and various Christian sects, the Mother Church being one of them, and many different doctrines, the largest and dominant sect or church had to define and confirm, step by step, its own view of life, its dogmas and traditions. The history of the Church is indeed astonishing, but whence did all these many dogmas and traditions originate? Who invented them? Nobody can be directly accused of having willfully invented or falsified a dogma, because by the synods only a more definite form was given to views already prevailing. Ignorance pure and simple is the original source of unreasonable and senseless doctrines. Every dogma was derived from a truth misunderstood and misrepresented. Indeed? Then the doctrine of the atoning death of Jesus was a truth misunderstood? Absolutely. The Gospels speak plainly of the Son sent to the world by a loving Father, and of the belief in him as the only possible salvation for men, while the epistles, etc., speak as plainly of a crucified Saviour. Thus we are made aware how the Church dogmas originated from these teachings, comprehending at the same time that the words of the New Testament convey a teaching veiling the truth and misrepresented entirely by the dogma of vicarious atonement. But let us not digress from our subject. During the first centuries, the doctrine of reincarnation was accepted by various Christian sects, only later to be condemned as heretical by the dominant sect. This only as an historical explanation. In order to assimilate the ethical philosophy of the Sermon on the Mount, it is not at all necessary to believe in different metaphysical or theological doctrines. That is why this explanation of mine has been made in passing, and we may again return to the commandments of Jesus.